G'day and welcome to another DFA live stream on the 23rd of June 2020. I'm Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics. Great to have you on board. Thanks for spending some time with us this evening. Very important show tonight. And I have Robbie Barwick online, and I'm just going to now let him speak. So if I push that button, and then if I push, let's have a go with that button. Robbie, you should be there.
I am.
Yeah, it's working.
Thanks, Martin.
Okay, great to have you. Great to have you on board. And we've got a load of conversations to have tonight on some very important topics. It couldn't be a more critical time, actually, to be talking about some of these things.
No, absolutely. Plus, let me add, I'm speaking to you from the COVID-19 colony of Australia, and right in my suburb, we're the hot spot. So this may be the only way I can communicate for the foreseeable future. But we've got lots to say.
Yep, no, that's good. And I'm pleased to say that your audio is, so to my ear anyway, pretty good. So we'll see what the jury says. But last time I had somebody on, they complained about the audio being a bit sort of thin. So hopefully it's good.
Well, I can always raise my voice if I'm provoked.
Yeah, that's right. Well, there's a little bit of headroom. Now, just by way of preamble, let me just make my normal comment here that what we're going to talk about tonight is not financial advice. We don't give financial advice. This is very much our opinions based on research and other things, but it's not financial advice. Also, please play nice in the chat room. No racial slurs. We are moderating. Plexus is helping with that. Thanks, Plexus. Appreciate your help there. This is the 23rd of June, so if you're watching this in replay, things may have changed. If you need and want to communicate and ask questions, please use @WalkTheWorld to get my attention, because there's always so much going on the chat that I quite often don't see it unless you actually use that. I've enabled Super Chat. A couple of you have already used it already. I appreciate that. And two things there. One is you can make sure that your question gets noticed. And secondly, if you'd like to make a contribution to help DFA with what it's doing, that's a way of doing it too. Now, with that introduction, I guess, Robbie, what we should just do is to just explain, I have no political affiliation with you and your party. It's just that we have a very strong convergence of opinions around the finance and banking system. But it might be good just for people to understand a little bit about the Citizens Party and, you know, what you stand for before we get into the details of the questions. So why don't you go off your long run and do that?
All right, good. And that'll give me an opportunity to plug a few things. So if you want to follow what the Citizens Party does stand for, we have our own show on YouTube and Channel 31 called The Citizens Report, and you can subscribe to that. Also, tomorrow, Martin, we are launching a new version of our show called Citizens Insight, which is an interview series. And tomorrow, the show we'll be putting up is me interviewing the former director of the ANZ Bank and former chairman of Woolworths, John Dalson, on the need for dairy industry re-regulation. And it's quite an extraordinary call by someone from John Dalson's background for that, because he has a more natural affinity to the deregulators. But his argument is this market is broken. So I urge people, watch those shows as we put them up on YouTube. Very important, and that dairy industry is an important subject. I mean, the Citizens Party is a 30-year plus political party in Australia, federally registered, and we're fighting for economic sovereignty in a nutshell, which is why we want an economy that works properly, but one that's democratically controlled. Hence our advocacy of a national bank, not the globalized central banking system controlling us as it happens at the moment. But along with national sovereignty, we really do want a world that is more cooperative, right? A world of sovereign nation states cooperating together on areas of mutual interest, mutual benefit, and those areas, you know, that should focus on economic development, mutually beneficial economic development that can raise living standards around the world. We don't have that kind of world at the moment, and consequently, we're always in the danger of hurtling into new wars which are completely destructive. So if we could concentrate on our economic development here, collaborate with other countries on economic development, we think Australia would be a better place and the world would be a better place. So that's in a nutshell what we stand for. But we do. I'm talking to you from my office here. I'll give the viewers who've come to this a show an insight. This is what's behind the door that people have seen. That's a room where we have people manning the phones all day, talking to people right around Australia, activating them, informing them, mobilising them to get engaged with the political process on the campaigns we run. We've got quite a large operation here in Melbourne. We're the most successful political party most people have never heard of, but that says more about the media than it does about us. Where Martin and I, ironically, where we first overlapped, Martin and the Citizens Electoral Council, now Citizens Party first overlapped, is on what we're going to talk about in a big way tonight, which is this question of bail-in. And that was, Martin, remember, 2.5 years ago when Martin first started covering this bail-in issue as well, which we were campaigning on. So it's issues like that, the cash ban, a national bank. We're not just trying to recruit support because we want power for power's sake. We actually want to change the country, but we're trying to recruit support because the change is only going to come about by public engagement. And what I find, and I know I'm a bit of a broken record on this, is it's the demoralisation factor in the public that I think is the biggest problem in politics. You can blame the politicians, and they're all jerks, and the media's jerks, etc. Well, that's true, but somewhere along the line, people gave up and said, "Oh, you'll never change anything anyway." And that is the ultimate self-fulfilling prophecy. If you believe you'll never change anything, you won't do anything, and by definition, you never will. Whereas we've shown in the last few years, as more and more people have got involved in this process, it can be damn effective. And I believe that we're in a period now where there's so much upheaval economically in the context of the pandemic, but it was going to happen anyway. There's a sea change in political consensus happening, and that's an opportunity to get through some fundamental changes, and we're determined to seize that opportunity.
Great, Robbie. Well, I appreciate that. And it's good to get a bit of perspective there. And I think it's very important people understand that the financial system and what's happening in the financial system is a very critical plank in the success or failure of an economy, right? And so, some people basically say, why are you throwing bricks at the banks? Well, we're not really. What we're saying is there's a better way for a better outcome for Australians if we can get our financial system to dance a different tune from the one that's been dancing for the last 30, 50, 60, 80 years, right? And in the current environment, specifically with regard to the post-COVID economic situations, what's happening to the banking system and the risks that spill over to ordinary citizens as a result of that are something that, one, people don't fully understand. Two, there are things that can be done, as you say. If we do nothing, then things will just get worse and worse. But if we do actually start making a fuss, then there's a chance we can actually direct things towards a better outcome. And three, the risks are building to the point where essentially the fuse is quite short to be able to actually deal with the issues that we know are there before effectively the whole system blows up. Now, I think you would probably agree with me, Robbie, that we are probably closer to a financial system implosion than we've probably ever been.
Absolutely. So 10 years ago, or time flies, it's over 10 years ago now, after post-2008, anybody paying attention knew that once they kicked in with the bailouts and then quantitative easing, that all the governments and central banks had achieved was kicking the can down the road. And the can has to stop somewhere. And the question in the last decade has always been, when's that going to stop, right? We didn't appreciate probably just how much money they were prepared to print through quantitative easing and those kind of measures. But then that runs into its own problems because they weren't actually fundamentally addressing the real problems in the economy, which is why the financial system was bankrupt, because we've got an unproductive economy. Now, there's any number of things that could have been the trigger, right? And of the crisis that we're in now, and there's an argument that there's a good reason to think that actually the financial crisis began September last year when the Federal Reserve very mysteriously started this repo bailout process and it just got bigger and bigger and bigger, and they couldn't extract themselves from it, and then suddenly the pandemic hits and bang, there's no limit now to what they can do, and they effectively said that. But there's one of the areas that we've concentrated on through this whole process is on what caused the crash in 2008, or a big part of what caused the crash in 2008, which was derivatives. Because, we're in, for 30 years plus, we've been in this, not just a disconnected financial system, an absolutely insane financial system. You make more money out of just straight financial gambling than any kind of productive process. That's what the derivatives market is, and it's not just insane gambling. It's often fraudulent. It's much of it is criminal. It's off the bank's books. It's off balance sheet. It's not audited. No one looks at this stuff until it blows up, until it's too late. And a strong sense I've had all this time, Martin, is because that's a big part of the problem. Flooding the system with liquidity may have helped paper over things you don't know about, but you cannot predict completely. When I say you, I mean the powers that be running the Federal Reserve and the Reserve Bank and the Bank of England and the Bank for International Settlements. They can't predict where things might unravel, what might blow up. Right? It's very, very difficult to get a handle on, and so they can think they've got it in hand, and then something happens in a direction they're not looking at, and suddenly a whole meltdown appears. Right? So today I can report, if you've got that chart there, we keep track of the Australian bank's derivatives figures, and they come out once a quarter from the Reserve Bank of Australia, and in the last quarter we've had this sharp spike upwards, $7.5 trillion to an all-time record of $53.2 trillion. And that's the Reserve Bank's figures. There's other sources that try and keep track of these figures as well, that some have a slight margin higher, but we'll just take the Reserve Banks. Look at that growth and look where the global financial crisis was in that growth, right? We've had, almost four times. Well, 40 trillion. There was about $14 trillion in 2008 Australian bank derivatives. Now it's $40 trillion more than that in 10 years. And when you see this, look at a chart like that and think of yourself as a doctor measuring a patient's temperature. That's not a boom, right? That's something that's worth panicking about there. That big unknown carries with it great danger, and that could all come crashing down very quickly in unpredictable ways.
Yeah, and it's just worth saying, of course, that's the gross exposures of the derivatives in Australia. Of course, there is a netting figure, right, but nobody quite knows what that netting figure is. And conveniently, the reporting is now not being done by the individual banks, so it's hard to get individual exposures, right? And the Bank for International Settlements, who used to publish gross exposure data on derivatives, stopped. They now only talk about the daily movements in derivatives, right? So they're trying to effectively walk away from this massive, I don't know what the total number is a quadrillion, who knows, right? Yeah. It's a huge number. And the point there, of course, is the exposure is the problem, because if rates move in a particular direction, then effectively the exposures can get very large. And those exposures are many, many times the capital of the banks. And in Australia, our major banks hold most of those derivatives, the same banks that hold your deposits, right? The same banks that actually make your loans, right? So there is a very clear and present danger from the derivatives sector, right? And by the way, it's the derivatives sector which the Fed has been propping up through its quantitative easing processes to try and keep the system afloat, right? Because if you look back at the repo, you mentioned repos earlier on, right? So there was a massive spike in the interest rates. If they hadn't intervened at that point, there would have been a degradation of the banking system. So they keep propping it up, but they don't actually deal with perhaps the critical issue. Now, Robbie, one of the things I just wanted to pick up, and this is just somebody earlier on, I'll just put this comment up because I think it's very relevant. This is from Turbine Graphics. He said, thousands signed the petition and it did nothing. Now, we're talking there about the cash ban, right? I think you would probably beg to differ with that position with regards to what we achieved with our petitions, right? 3,500 to Treasury, 2,500 to the Senate inquiry.
Yeah, and the change.org petition got well over 20,000 signatures, and that's probably what that comment refers to. The submissions, though, to the Treasury and the Senate inquiry were in the multiples of thousands, 3,600 and I think 2,600 effectively. And those are people actually writing letters and writing prepared submissions, and that was very effective. So I've expressed a slight difference of opinion with some of the other players on the leaders of the cash ban campaign, such as John Adams. We have declared a qualified victory, and in fact, there's more information coming out every day that backs up the reason for a qualified victory. So, for instance, I can inform the show that the Black Economy Division of the Treasury, which is the division that cooked up the Black Economy Task Force, which cooked up the cash ban policy, that division has been disbanded. Now, the policy hasn't officially gone away, and I'll credit John Adams with that information. He found that out, but I'm sure he won't mind me sharing it. There's another division of the Treasury related to tax that's now got carriage of the policy. However, the main point is they in Treasury are waiting for a government decision. So it's become a political process, and that's what we affected, the political process. And we have made it a red-hot issue for the government. They know if they touch that, they're going to get burned. It doesn't mean out of desperation they might not push that, but there was a lot of feedback after the inquiry reported, which we certainly influenced. And every step of that inquiry we influenced. We influenced it not just with the submissions, but then those submissions and the phone calls people made, they had a big impact on the two senators who did a really good job in the hearings, Labor Senator Alex Gallagher and Senator Rex Patrick, and then another Labor Senator, Kimberly Kitching, when she replaced Alex Gallagher when he got sick. From the beginning, they said, we are responding to this because of the amount of public outcry over this, right? And then they really pushed hard in their questions. And Alex Gallagher in particular in that December 12 hearing last year, I mean, he sat there all day and was just incredibly persistent, and he showed up the Treasury and all the other experts for having no evidence for this, and it changed the complexion of the whole inquiry. Well, it's very important to remember that came about, as he acknowledged many times during the day, because of the number of people contacting him, because of the number of submissions. So that was noticed. You know, don't think we failed there. We didn't fail. And when they produced the report, although they officially signed off on it, they had this caveat of 8 things I think it was 8 that they demanded to be done. And that was written by government members, not Labor members. The government members wanted all these changes. And we've had very strong feedback from contacts in the Liberal Party saying this is going nowhere. So the alternative school of thought is you always got to be suspicious about these guys because they're snakes. And of course that's all true, but we will watch it like a hawk. I have more reason to believe today that we've made that policy virtually impossible than I did even a few weeks ago when I announced that. Now, that said, I do want to highlight something that we have to pay attention to as well. And I'm calling on the viewers of this show and all Australians, and we'll put out some information about this. I think we need to start a bit of a boycott campaign of businesses that are using the pandemic, the coronavirus pandemic, as cover to ban cash. Now, it's not small businesses, right? So when there was a real panic, justifiably so, people all went a bit cashless, and even small businesses were prepared to comply. But I know about a month ago when I ventured out, and remember, I'm in the coronavirus hotspot of Australia. I went to a baker, I went to a butcher, and I went to a few other places, and I'd say cash or card, And these small businesses jumped at me, cash, cash. And a few of them went on a rant about the banks. They're not trying to avoid tax, these businesses. They're trying to avoid bank charges, right? But what we're seeing is chain stores, chain restaurants, and one of the ones I know about is Nando's, and I know there's a bunch of others, and people watching the show will know a bunch of others as well. I don't know if they've got some incentive from the banks, but they are going cashless, and it's using the pandemic as an excuse, but it's no excuse, because we know the World Health Organization does not recommend banning cash. And the World Health Organization's position is that it would create a false sense of security, because if you ban cash, but think, oh, well, I'm not using cash, I'm using my card, then I'm safe. No, you can be just as unsafe using your card. The World Health Organization position is you've got to wash your hands on everything. So there's no point singling out cash. The Royal Australian Mint repeated the World Health Organization's warning, and that's ironic because that's effectively the government saying that, our government saying there's no reason to ban cash. And most recently, we wrote this, but there was a freedom. We wrote this up in an article which is on our website. There's a Freedom of Information document or release of that's come to light that we reported on, which was correspondence between the Reserve Bank, the CSIRO, and the University of Ballarat, going back to 2004 in the SARS outbreak, discussing this question of cash being a vector for the transmission of viruses. And they concluded that, of course, while there's a certain amount of danger there, and I'm not urging anyone to be irresponsible, while there's a certain amount of danger, there's no point singling it out. You shouldn't single out cash as any more dangerous than any other form of payment, because if it makes people drop their guard. And so that's the official position of real experts who've looked at this, including the CSIRO, right? We've put those articles on our website. If you see a business that's not taking cash, you should go and confront them or call them up and say, why aren't you taking cash? I will not shop there. This is not based on science. Here's the facts. Go, you cite the sources, right? But let's start giving them a hard time, because the reason I'm particularly motivated by this is, even though you said earlier, Martin, that you're not throwing bricks at the banks, let's say we have a bit of division of labour. At least you're like the mild-mannered superhero among us during the day. I don't know what you get up to at night, but I'm sure it's destructive to the banks. We do throw bricks at it. That's our part of the division of labour. And Channel 7 had, some people might have seen this on Facebook, Channel 7 had a report on Friday night, which was pretty outrageous, where the banks were actually bragging that they've achieved in 10 weeks a move to cashlessness that they had planned to achieve over 5 years. They had a 5-year plan to move us to less cash, and they've achieved it in 10 weeks. Well, that's outrageous. They're the only beneficiaries of any kind of restrictions on cash. It traps us all in the banks. We can't escape their bad policies. We can't escape negative interest rates. We can't escape bail-in. And these chain businesses, frankly, are either in on it or they're suckers. And this is one of those things where I'm not saying let's go pick at them, and I don't think a boycott per se will work, but we should spread the news, share these articles around. But you should, I think, be proactive. You see a business that's not taking cash, confront them politely, right, and say, look, here's the official information why you shouldn't not take cash, right? And if it's business like Nando's or whatever, call them up. If they start getting enough calls, they will have second thoughts. The problem is the MBAs, the people with MBAs who manage these companies, they're probably stupid enough to think, oh yeah, everyone wants to give up cash anyway. It's Brave New World. Well, let's push
Robbie,
back.
I want to put this up. This is hilarious. I've just come in, right, from Richard. I got a free lunch from Nando's when I refused to use the card and only pay cash. Told the manager it was illegal, so he rang it through at naught. Well done, Richard. There you go. You've heard it here. Go to Nando's, refuse to do other than pay by cash, and you might get a free meal.
Hey, good on you, Richard. And I know Richard. Good on you, mate. We're calling it. I consulted a legal expert on this. If you go to a restaurant like Nando's, and if you get away with Richard's method, definitely do that. Right, that's the number one approach. But otherwise, if you go to pay and they say they don't take cash and you want to pay cash, just you're perfectly within your rights to leave to put the money down and leave. So we're calling
this is what Chris says. So if a shop doesn't accept cash, leave the items you intend to buy on the counter and walk out.
Okay, you can do it that way as well. That's certainly a very good protest too, right? If you've got an alternative to that, but a restaurant's a little bit similar because if you've go ahead and eat and then pay afterwards. But you can leave the cash there and walk out, and we're calling it the Keep the Change campaign. You do risk not getting any change, so carry small denomination notes on you, right? But tell them keep the change and leave. They can't do anything. You've paid you've tendered payment for their bill, right? And it's perfectly legal. This will, I think we can actually put the brakes on this, because it's not, I wouldn't be so fired up if it was just Nando's, but when the banks are bragging, right, they've achieved in 10 weeks what they'd planned in 5 years, and they should have been planning it in 5 years anyway, over 5 years anyway, well, that fires me up.
Right, and of course the point is the banks want to get rid of cash because it's expensive to manage, and it would be much cheaper to trap us in the digital system rather than actually to be able to use cash. So that's their agenda, but our agenda is to allow civil liberties to continue and to continue to use cash if you want to use cash. And it's not just an intergenerational thing either, by the way. Even some young people, according to my surveys, are still comfortable and want to use cash. So, it's important that we don't just let this thing go through the back door, because, of course...
Exactly.
Go on.
Well, and this question of control by the banks is key, because we speaking for the Citizens Party, we fully subscribe to the civil liberties issues, etc. as well. But we had this other concern that here we are trying to reform the banking system, right? And the banking system is in a really bad way. And as it gets worse, people will naturally vote with their feet and withdraw and find alternatives if they can. And this is designed to stop that, right? So that they can go with their agenda to keep themselves propped up at our expense, which is these policies like negative interest rates and bail-ins. But that is premised on trapping people in the banks, and that's why we just cannot tolerate it. We can't, cash is legal tender. The rest is, nowhere near as reliable. So don't give up your rights on it.
Yeah, Robbie, absolutely. Now here we should pick up Joseph's conversation here. Can Robbie talk about the bank bail-in using cash deposits? Of course he can.
All right, here we go. So I hope plenty of most of the viewers watched your show on Interest of the People with John Adams yesterday on this. So why this has suddenly come up as an issue is not just because of the general bank danger, although that's absolutely real, but we've been working really hard, not really behind the scenes, but some of this work ends up getting done behind the scenes. We haven't given up the fight to actually stop this question of a bail-in from happening. So I'll go through the details of bail-in in a minute, but just to say we have an inquiry now. And as I talk, the whole purpose of what I'm about to explain to you is so you go to the effort of make another submission yet again, right? Never give up, never surrender. You'll be the best qualified submission makers in the world. At one stage, you probably already are, but it's worth doing. And I'm pretty excited about this particular inquiry. We've got media interest already, which I know 2.5 years ago when we fought this bill, there was very little of that, right? So now we've got some media interest. It intersects the cash ban. People know the connection, and parliamentarians were already reeling from what they copped from the public over the cash ban. I think we can put them in the same frame of mind on this. Plus, the committee looking at this is the same committee that looked at the cash ban, which is a different makeup, except for one senator. The rest of the committee is different than the committee when this committee looked at bail-in 2.5 years ago, right? Now, that committee did a cover-up. This committee, already softened up by the cash ban, I think we're capable of getting them to see a bit of reason on this, and that'll start with them getting flooded with submissions, right? So here's the issue. 2009, the G20 told the Financial Stability Board at the Bank for International Settlements to come up with a new policy to resolve future banking crises, ostensibly without resorting to bailouts, because all the governments said, man, when we bailed out the banks, right, we were almost crucified by the public, right? They thought these bastards, and I think I've mentioned on your show before, Martin, to me the defining image of the 2008 crash was this protest in New York where some homeless-looking black man's holding up a sign saying, "Pull yourself up by your bootstraps," right? I mean, that kind of, this was really primal rage that poured out from the public, then so it should. And then banks got this massive bailout, and 12 million Americans was then the same banks forced 12 million Americans out of their homes onto the streets, often on homes that the banks didn't even have the title to at the time. It was so unjust and outrageous it wasn't funny. So the governments knew, hang on, we're not going to get away with this again. And they said, we need a way to avoid bailouts, as if bailouts was the great evil. The great evil, of course, was the injustice. So they gave these clowns at the Financial Stability Board this job, and the main guy in charge of the Financial Stability Board at the time was Mario Draghi, ex-Goldman Sachs, now the head of the immediate ex-head of the European Central Bank. I don't know where Mario's actually gone at the moment. And they cooked up bail-in. Oh, here we go. Here's a way to save banks without taxpayers. Make the poor mug, innocent, unaware depositors pay for the bank losses when it's about to fail, right? And this was issued as a policy in 2011 called the Key Attributes of Effective Resolution Regimes. All the G20 member nations signed onto it, including Australia. It was first used in 2013 in Cyprus to bail in two banks there, to give a haircut to their depositors. That got a lot of attention around the world. I remember the reaction to it was huge, like, whoa, how is this possible that suddenly depositors can lose their money in this way without a bank failing and just going completely bankrupt where, you get a piece of what's left. The bank stays alive, but you're forced to lose your money, and it was. And the term that we all got introduced to was unsecured creditors. You think you've put your money in the bank for safekeeping, right? No, you're an unsecured creditor. And this was like an accounting term, but this is technically what a depositor is. And I have to, you and John did that really excellent show on, a deposit means you've loaned money to the bank. Well, the month after bail-in happened in Cyprus, the Financial Stability Board did an update report, April 29, 2013, and it's called Implementing the Key Attributes of Effective Resolution Regimes. How far have we come? And in that, we're reading through it because we were researching everything on bail-in at the time. And in that was this very revealing paragraph that said, bail-in legislation is in train in Australia. So we started blowing the whistle on that everywhere, and we spent the next number of years looking for every bit of evidence of that. We found quite a bit of evidence of it, but we started, making a big deal about it. I think the IMF was acknowledging that last year when it said in a report that the Australian government has taken a cautious public stance on bail-in. Basically mean they're trying to do this under the radar because they know it's politically toxic. Yeah, because we made it toxic just by informing the public that this was an issue, right? But in 2017, there's a lot of pressure mounting because of the G20 nations. The ones in North America and Europe had pushed ahead with legislating bail-in. But the ones in the Asia Pacific were really lagging, except for New Zealand. New Zealand had bail-in for deposits and a really explicit system they've got over there, quite scary. And by the way, their banks are our banks. So the bank customers of our banks in New Zealand can lose their deposits. That's explicit, but they claim ours can't here. So, but our other close countries as well, the United States, the United Kingdom, Europe, Canada, all have bail-in systems that take deposits. So they introduced this bill here in 2017. It was in August. It was very similar to the cash ban last year. It was released on late August, Friday afternoon, when no one was paying attention except Doug Mitchell in our office. Happened to be, he saw some alert on the computer about about some legislation. He just recognised the title, Financial System Amendment, Crisis Resolution and Other Powers Bill, and Doug recognised from the title, hang on, he sent it to me, is this related to bail-in? And we looked at it and, hell yeah. And we got an inquiry going. We identified there was this, it's mainly about the bail-in of what they call bail-inable bonds, right? Or instruments that have bail-in their terms and conditions. That's what the bill is mainly about, giving APRA the power to order those things be bailed in. Well, those things do have them in their terms and conditions, so they're perfect candidates to be bailed in. That's fine. The only problem with those particular instruments is in Australia they're sold to mum and dad investors, which they shouldn't be, because in other jurisdictions like the UK they're not allowed to be because they're not aware of the risk. So there's probably hundreds of thousands of pensioners around Australia or retirees holding these things and aren't aware that these could be bailed in like that. But that's what that legislation was mainly for, except it had this extra wording in there saying that these provisions for conversion and write-off can apply to those instruments or any other instrument. And that wording is like, as big enough to drive a truck through as a loophole. So we made an issue about that. And what happened was they did an inquiry. The government submissions to the inquiry from the Treasury, the RBA, APRA, ASIC, they all said the same thing. No, this does not mean deposits will be bailed in. Absolutely not. And their letters, in fact, you can see them on that inquiry website now, the submissions these institutions made. The submissions are really well worded. There is no room for doubt in their submission. The problem is those submissions are not legislation. It's meaningless unless the legislation itself has this really broad, vague wording. That's where the law is, not in these letters of reassurance, right? And they expected us to buy that, and we didn't buy it, and we fought it. But this is the bill that on Valentine's Day, I'm sitting in the Senate gallery with Dr. Wilson Sy, the former principal researcher of APRA. He came to Canberra with me, and we're trying to talk to politicians about this. We're sitting in the gallery, and there's 8 people present, and like that, Michaela Cash keeps jumping up to first reading, second reading, third reading, and this thing is passed into law like that. And I get up to leave, and Wilson said, "What's happened?" I said, "It's passed." And it's the first time he'd seen it. He goes, "How could that pass so quickly?" And what we were waiting for was we had teed up One Nation the night before to move an amendment to exclude deposits from that clause. And a lot of people might be familiar with the story, but One Nation had told the government they intended to do that, and the government had said, "Okay, we'll have a look at it and get back to you." And while they knew the One Nation senators were waiting in their offices, they rammed it through while they weren't in the chamber. And they expect us to trust them that they'll never bail in deposits, right? And then later on, you and John actually proved how the loophole could work by the banks being able to change their terms and conditions. So what we have is a bill that we drafted and Malcolm Roberts from One Nation introduced in February, called the Banking Amendment Deposits Bill 2020. And all that bill will do is what One Nation tried to do in February 2018. It inserts an exclusion for deposits into this bill. That's all it does. It excludes deposits from any other instrument. It defines what deposits are, and that's really broad, so that there's no deposit that it misses out, right? So they can't use that. And the only other thing it does is it forbids APRA from taking the path of changing terms and conditions as a ad hoc way of doing it, right? So it does that as well. So this bill will protect deposits, and if the government is genuine at all in saying that they will not bail in deposits, all we're saying is good. Put it in writing in the bill. There's no reason for the government to oppose this. And if they don't put it in writing in the bill, they are revealing their hand, which would relate to why they wouldn't want to, which would relate to the fact that all the countries closest to us, all the G20 members are expected to have this power to bail in deposits. Who's our government kidding when they say they're the only country not going to do that? Now, we can make sure we're the only country that doesn't do it by getting this kind of law through, right, by getting the public engaged. We've already made this a very hard issue for the government in Australia. In these other jurisdictions, they ran bail-in through before the public were aware of anything. In America, it was rammed through in the Dodd-Frank bill, which was this 800-page monstrosity that no one could read, and that's where they snuck it through there. In New Zealand, they didn't even legislate it. The Reserve Bank just decreed it. But here, they've had to, they looked for a backdoor way to do it. We've caught them, and we can stop them by presenting this argument to them. And there's a lot of new members of Parliament from the 2019 election. There's most of the members of this committee are new. We can really put this sort of ultimatum to them that there's no good reason to oppose this amendment if they're genuine about not bailing in deposits. And if they do oppose it, what does that really mean? And we'll blow the whistle on that.
Okay, I knew you were going to come off your long run on that one, Robbie, so thank you for that. And it's just worth saying, if everybody believes that this is a conspiracy and not real, look at New Zealand, right? Because in New Zealand, there's the open banking resolution, which is go to the RBNZ site, you can go in there and have a look at it, and it clearly says that in a case of a bank getting into difficulty, they will freeze the deposits in the bank, convert a proportion of those deposits into equity sufficient to restructure the bank and allow it to continue to trade, and then you'll later get some of your deposits back.
You'll get back, they say in their lovely diagram there, they say you'll return the unused portion of your deposits. So sorry, no, we're taking your deposits.
Yep.
Right. And here's the thing though. People might think, yeah, but why would the government lie about this? Well, Martin and I this week have both seen a letter that a New Zealand resident got from the New Zealand Finance Minister, the equivalent of their Josh Frydenberg, who said in that letter there are no bail-in powers in New Zealand. Yet you can go to their own Reserve Bank and they brag about them. The letter is an outright lie, and we'll do some information on that for our New Zealand viewers. People in New Zealand should make an issue out of this. The New Zealand Finance Minister is either a liar or a buffoon, right? He shouldn't be the Finance Minister if he doesn't know what powers are in New Zealand. It is black and white categorically how wrong he is, but there's a reason he'd lie, because they don't want people to, this is such a crazy idea, and it's the same reason they're trying to lie here. So that's not a conspiracy theory. We've called him out always to Sunday. Read the details. We've got them all on our website. In fact, there's a bail-in section on our website people can go to, and we do have a bail-in petition. It's worth signing these things and sharing them. We've got a bail-in petition. We can provide the link. It's on our website as well. In fact, I know I've got some Citizens Party members on the live stream. Maybe someone could put the link on the live stream chat there, and you can share that petition link around. Let's get that circulating in the next 3 weeks as well. But we've got till the 10th of July to make submissions on this, right? So we'll do a release tomorrow. John and Martin provided excellent information yesterday. There's a link there. You can make your submission. What I would say, if you're someone who's made submissions before, it's worth thinking about making a submission that they have to accept. Well, they don't necessarily have to accept it, but make it harder for them to knock it back and just dismiss it as correspondence. Because the website of this inquiry has actually preempted that. Mark Fett, the man that I had harsh words with last December, haven't spoken to since. Mark Fett he knows that this submission is going to be flooded, and he's already said there on the website, he said, know in advance that not all submissions will be published. So what you do, instead of writing an email and just sending the email straight to the committee, write it in a Word document and save it as an attachment and either email it, or it's even better to go onto the website and follow the upload procedure. If you can upload a file that you're presenting, and it's better if you even save it as a PDF, right? Upload a PDF or a Word file. You are providing it in the best possible form for them to just publish, right? And it will be much, if they still knock it back, then it will help you make us think about it.
Yeah, and it's important because, what we've now effectively is created a trap for the government, right? So basically, if they turn around and say, no, we're not going to do this, when in fact everybody from the RBA and APRA and the government said, no, there's no issue, then you've got to ask the question, well, why would you actually not rule out deposits? And if they actually aren't prepared to rule out the deposits, from what we've seen, we've got to assume that there's nefarious acts in their minds. They want to keep it loosey-goosey, flexible, and Yep. The other point to make, Robbie, is a number of senior politicians, including Jane Hume, when people write to them about the bail-in, they get an answer on 250k bank deposits.
Yeah.
Right? And the fact that those are sort of guaranteed. Now, let's just be really clear about this. Is really important to understand, right? Bail-in stops a failing bank from failing by taking some of those deposits converting them into equity, and allowing the bank to continue to trade. Therefore, a 250k deposit guarantee is not activated because it's only activated, one, when the government says it's going to be activated, and two, when the bank has already failed.
That's right. That is the rules of the financial claims scheme.
Yeah.
Dr. Wilson Tsai, he actually, this is when I got to know Wilson, he approached us with that information, that because he was the former principal researcher at APRA anyway, and he said, look at their own rules of this supposed guarantee. It must first be activated. And the government is under no obligation to activate it, but it's activated when a bank fails. But even then, the government is under no obligation to activate it. They have the discretion to. And would you know it, the day after, or the week after the law was passed in 2018, Scott Morrison was the treasurer then, and he wrote a reply to Ken Wyatt, who had forwarded him a constituent letter, and Ken Wyatt's the Indigenous Affairs Minister now. Ken Wyatt had forwarded Morrison a constituent's letter about bail-in, and Morrison replied and addressed that issue and acknowledged that, yes, it's at the government's discretion to activate bail-in. Now, Wilson and I had sat there with Jane Hume minutes before the bail-in law passed. She gave us a 5-minute meeting and she through gritted teeth, and we had discussed this, and she said, of course deposits are guaranteed. Of course it's activated. Of course it's activated. Right? And again, she was either lying, but in her case, I wouldn't be surprised if she was just ignorant of their own policy. It's got its own rules. These things are not activated, and they're only activated. There's only a chance to activate it when it fails. And you're right. Bail-in is to be applied before it even gets to that process. So that part's true, and it's also true that right now, all of us with deposits in the banks who think we're covered by this guarantee, it's an unactivated guarantee. There's no actual guarantee in force, in effect right now. That will be only in effect if the government chooses to activate it at the time of a bank failure.
Yeah, and that's the dilemma. And by the way, before we went live, somebody asked about superannuation accounts held in corporate superstructures. They are not actually even guaranteed under the 250k guarantee because it's a corporate thing rather than actually a personal deposit. So that's another reason to be a little bit cautious of this.
Yeah, for sure. A lot of people, the cash component of super, which of course has been big in the context of financial, concerns. That's all at risk.
Yep. All right. Well, let's move the conversation on. Now, by the way, I should tell you, Robbie, you're not seeing the conversations. There's been a lot of people asking about China. We will get to China, but not yet, right? Because I know that once we get on that, we'll never get off it.
We're on the slow boat. We're on the slow boat to China.
But there was a very interesting from Dino saying, next subject, national bank. Now, I think we have to talk about national bank because this is probably strategically as important as many of the other things that we've been touching on this evening. And again, kudos to you guys. You've been very much leading the charge here. And just to add a couple of points to that, Robbie, somebody else asked earlier on, what would stop another creating a national bank? Yeah, but then actually getting privatized again like CBA, right? Wouldn't we just go around the traps again? So anyway, let's just sort of take it from the top, okay? The reason for a national bank is because the commercial banks aren't supporting Australia appropriately. They're not actually lending for productive purposes. They just prefer to do mortgage lending because it's more effective and cheaper for them, but actually doesn't help Australia, right? So there's a huge gap, and you've got a suggestion, a program of activity that potentially allows us to move into a more productive banking model.
Yeah, and think about it in these terms. From 1911 to 1996, we had the Commonwealth Bank. So how old is Australia? 120 years old, right? Well, the great majority of that time, we had a national bank. From 1959 to 1996, we had the Commonwealth Development Bank. Interspersed among that, we had state banks, we had state development banks, and except for some scandals in the 80s that in Adelaide and Victoria, etc., that were in the context of all the craziness of the 80s, all the deregulation, etc., except for those scandals, those banks performed really, really well. They weren't got rid of because they were like the Commonwealth Bank wasn't privatised because it was a failure. It was privatised because it was a success, because bankers hijacked the two major political parties. They never wanted to compete with the public option, and they made sure they got rid of it. And I once, in the Commonwealth Bank, when its final sale it was sold in three parts. When it was completed in 1996, the total sale price was, I think, $7.8 billion. And over the next 20, so that was the total sale price of the Commonwealth Bank in 1996. Over the next 20 years, that bank's profit added up to $100 billion, right? Now, that was always an effective bank before it was privatised, but that profit stayed in the community. That helped the community, right? Suddenly it could be extracted and put it in, and we're told put in our super. So yeah, we've had a period of 20 plus years where the private banks have had their way with the economy, and it has been a disaster. Now, some of my dear correspondents on Twitter and on this show are trying to convince me, Martin, it's because we didn't adopt a free market capitalism that was pure enough, right? Well, that's their argument, and Harold and the others know who I'm talking about. Call out to Harold. But that's theoretical, right? The fact remains is we want something that works, and there was nothing that didn't work about what we had before. So we have a situation where the COVID-19 pandemic has come along, and it could have been anything. A war would have achieved the same thing. A really serious global financial crisis would have achieved the same thing. If there was a situation where our economy's reliance on overseas, especially for imports, was tested, like it has been with the COVID-19, then it really brings into stark relief what we've done to ourselves, especially this collapse of manufacturing, right? And interestingly enough, everyone knows we've become this much more resources, raw material exports based economy. Paul Kelly, the doyen of the press gallery, in his book on the reforms of the 1980s called the End of Certainty, actually has a very revealing section in there about this gang of free marketeers that took over the Liberal Party in the 80s, and they started off holding these secret meetings in 1982, secret from the Prime Minister Malcolm Fraser, because he knew they wouldn't tolerate him. So this was literally a plot Paul Kelly's describing, and they're starting this free market movement, and the initial funders were all what? Resource companies, right? Because they all just wanted a total unregulated free market where all they had to do was ship stuff overseas, unprocessed raw materials overseas. Well, we're now paying for the consequences of all that, and we're way too dependent on overseas. Yes, we are way too dependent on China and a bunch of other countries, but especially China. Way too dependent on it. It's terrible. If the Citizens Party, all you people who call me a commie and China lover, if the Citizens Party had been in power for the last 30 years, we would not be dependent on China. We would be doing great business with China, but we would not be dependent on China. We're the only political party that would have made sure we weren't, right? I just won't tolerate, I'm preempting later, I won't tolerate the same parties that made us dependent on China turning around and telling me that now I've got to be worried about them as the enemy, rather than the political parties and the bankers and all those people who took advantage of the situation. China didn't stuff our economy, they did. China didn't rape America, Wall Street did, right? And we've had this horrible rhetoric in the last few years, which is unconscionable if you're honest and paying attention to what actually went on. So we wouldn't have let this happen, and we've got to change it. And you don't change it through a trade war. You change it by getting your unleashing the potential of your economy. If I don't know, it wouldn't take much of a percentage of all the money that's poured into the property market over the last 20 years that's given us this horrible bubble. Just imagine if, say, a third of that had gone into backing manufacturing industries and building significant infrastructure that could keep the Murray-Darling Basin from running out of water, so that the irrigators didn't have to give up their water rights and could still keep growing agriculture to feed us and the world. Just imagine if there's all these innovations and inventions that creative people in Australia have produced that no one here would back, and so overseas interests Often overseas development banks of foreign governments have come to Australia and poached our innovators and inventors and taken them overseas because no one here was willing to back them. The banks didn't care. The government didn't care. Just imagine if we say a third of the money that had gone into the property bubble had gone into that, right? We would look so much different now. It wasn't funny. We have a member. He's in a retirement home now, a very old guy, Joe Carmody. He was a member of our party because he believed in what we stand for. And this guy, in the face of huge pressure, kept his protective mask manufacturing business going in Shepparton. He could have outsourced it like everybody else did, but he kept it going. He refused to. And it was the only one left in Australia when this crisis hit that the government could turn to say, oh, we need to ramp up mask production. And they sent the army down from Puckapunyal to Shepparton to help man this extra increase of masks. Well, there's a reason that guy was a member of our party, right? Because he believed in this and what we stand for. But where a bank comes into it is because you need money, you need investment, you need backing. And I'm not, all these people telling me, oh, you can't, the government shouldn't pick winners, etc. They did pick winners. They picked the same people saying you shouldn't pick winners, picked the resources sector. That was their winner. Picked the property bubble. That was their winner. The rest of Australia be damned. Well, screw that. My attitude is you shouldn't be picking losers, right? That's what the government shouldn't be doing, is picking losers. Yeah, they'll make mistakes, but the kind of mistakes the government's going to make is nothing compared to what we've tolerated from Wall Street and the private banks, right? Some things they back may not work, but there's so many more things that we can transform the country in a really positive way. So let's take, our idea is if you bring back the bank, bring back a public bank, you can say capitalise it with $50 or $100 billion by issuing bonds to Australian super funds. These super funds, Bob Hawke, I can show you that you can find on YouTube the 1990 election campaign ad where Bob Hawke promised that Australian super would be invested in the development of Australia and we wouldn't have to borrow from overseas. That was his election promise. And the opposite's true. Australian super is now invested all around the world. Canadian super or pension money comes in here. It's all a big, merry-go-round that all the managers get their cut from. This is all garbage. Let's get the super funds would jump at guaranteed investments in a government bank. That can be the basis of normal banking. This is the power of banking, right? Use the normal capacity of banking, say at a conservative lending ratio of 10 to 1, and suddenly the government's not the borrower, it's the lender. And the lender has the power, right? And you can lend to state, federal agencies, state governments and local governments for infrastructure. And a lot of important infrastructure, real infrastructure, hard infrastructure, that always gets put off and it's too hard and whatever, and there's all sorts of reasons not to do it. We'll just do it, right? You'll create lots of jobs. I'm most excited about the potential for industry. So there's I don't know if there's a gentleman I talked to a lot lately, a Czechoslovakian immigrant to Australia, Paul Jindra. Call out to Paul if you're watching. Paul's calling me up every few days with these other tips, because I met Paul at a cash ban protest in March outside a Liberal Party meeting here in Melbourne that Michael Sukkar was presenting, and a few of us turned up. And that's when I had the Chopper Read poster I was holding. And Paul's chatting to me, and he's talking about how terrible Australia is industrial-wise, because that's his area. He's a high technology engineer. And he said, oh, you'll never change it. You need a crisis. And then when the coronavirus hit, he texted me and said, here's the crisis. And he's telling me all these examples of businesses that we've lost. And he said, look, and that's right, he called me when the government announced $130 billion that they were going to borrow for JobKeeper to pay everyone to sit home idle, right? Because the whole problem with coronavirus has shown just how much our economy is non-essential. Right, those jobs are important for the people who've got them. I'm not minimising those jobs, but they're it's part of a non-essential, consumption-based economy. And Paul said, look, if we're going to give away $130 billion for people to sit home, why doesn't the government take $5 billion of that divided up among 1,000 engineering firms. He said the thing with these engineers is they're no good with money. All they want to do is perfect their product, right? But the money gets in the way and they can never get backing, etc. Give them the money, give them $1 million or $2 million and say, here, that's to employ people to progress your idea to production, right? And he said the worst that can happen at the end is you get some production out of the money. But he said it'll be better than that. You will have, some will fail. A lot will succeed. 10 will become bigger than BHP, right? And then he told me the story about how in 1970, there was an electronics company here in Melbourne called Fairchild Australia, which was just on the cusp of getting into microprocessor production. That's where they were manufacturing transistors, and that's where the technology was heading. But they had some financial problems. They couldn't get backing from the banks, and they couldn't get backing from. They approached the government, and the government just didn't get what they were trying to do. And this was a case of not having vision. So it didn't go anywhere. But a division of that company went on to start Intel in the United States, and that became the basis of an industry in microprocessors, microchips, that's 4 times bigger than the oil industry, right? Paul said we could have had Silicon Valley here in Melbourne in Australia, because that's where this company was, Fairchild Australia was based, and instead, all that potential went overseas. And then Paul said something to me that I thought was really profound. I've been telling everyone ever since. He said, Australia's curse is its resources. And this is actually a phenomenon. Someone then informed me this is a phenomenon in economics that's known. The resources curse. We make money really easily by digging stuff up and shipping it out overseas, but there's no creativity involved, right? Whereas countries that don't have that are forced to innovate, and we can innovate, but we don't actually have to. And so the way that things have settled lately, we don't. So we need to turn that around. We turn that around, there's lots of potential to unleash in this country, lots of innovation that can start really employing people, not as cheap services jobs that Paul Keating espoused, that I played on my show once, but as high-skilled, high-paid jobs. But it needs backing, right? And what the banks do, some banks might, a specialised bank here or there might be good at this or might decide to get into this, but the government's involvement through a development bank is provides seed capital, and it's the same as putting, blood in the water, and then all the sharks gravitate on it because they get a sniff of the blood. The private sector will come in when they see something actually successful, and then, all sorts of things can happen from that. It can just mushroom, but without the public investment role, right? There's often very unlikely it can happen, right? And so that's what it is. It's not about, and it's not about the government saying top down. We decide we will do this. We will decide to do that. Make the bank available. So we envisage a development bank that can have multiple divisions, because there should be a specialised agriculture lender, because that's a specialised case, specialised industry lenders, and manned by people with real skills, plus people that have skills in marketing and trade, developing trade links with other countries, and already have those links to help out. So the innovator can approach that institution and say, I need some backing. Right, and they don't just get financial backing. They can say, "Look, we've got this advice for you. You can connect you to this guy, etc." And suddenly, our potential can start being realised. So we're drafting we had intended to turn under emergency conditions, the Clean Energy Finance Corporation into that. That was stymied by this rule change, or this rule in Parliament that I explained in our show last week. I won't go through it now. So what we're going to do is draft the legislation for a standalone option. Bobcat is really big on this, and I have to put in a good word for Bob, because the media make Bob look like a bit of a character, but I tell you what, when you actually pay attention to what Bob says, he has a lot of substance, he's got a lot of experience, and he ran an investment institution in Queensland that actually created the coal export industry, and put aside the politics of that now, but it turned, that's our second biggest earner, right? That's what Bob says. You can either have absorb money projects like football stadiums or make money projects, right? And they put in railways and things like that in central Queensland in the 80s, and now that's the second biggest export earner in Australia. So he's got a lot of experience in that, and he's really keen to introduce this bank. And I think we're getting people in Parliament putting their hands up to support, partly because some have long thought this is a great idea. It's really interesting. We've got Senator Gerard Rennick that Martin, you interviewed a few weeks ago. He's a sitting Liberal who's enthusiastically endorsing this idea, and that's kind of unusual for a sitting member of a major party to be outspoken like that, but it's a sign of the times. So after this, bail-in inquiry campaign is out of the way in a few weeks, we'll be putting up the legislation and putting a lot more emphasis on that.
Right, thanks, Robbie. That was again another long run, but very important. And just a couple of updates. I'm in conversation at the moment with a Australian company who is one of the leading technology innovators in Australia, and we're going to collaborate on a series of programs on innovation, and specifically on the gap that there is. So I saw a few comments in the chat saying small businesses can't, get the help they need. Entrepreneurs can't get the help they need to get going, right? Because the systems and processes don't work in Australia. So that's something that we're going to focus on, because it's my passion that we are missing a huge opportunity in creating a bunch of innovative new businesses in Australia in a number of different fields. And if we could put some of those structures in place, that will be quite helpful. So watch out for those shows. It'll be a little while down the track before they come out, but there'll be a series of them. And the idea is that we're going to get other people who are entrepreneurs at the moment to tell their story. And I've actually recorded one already. So there's a company in Western Australia who have installed LED street lamps powered by solar, right? But the story that they had to get that up and running and the lack of support they got is, it made you cry. You just realize how hard it is to move businesses forward, businesses with great ideas, but just the barriers of the processes and systems. So I think that'll be an important thing to explore too. But
absolutely, and look what we're seeing now with the government. They sounded good for a few weeks there in the middle of the pandemic, but now it's just back to the trying to pump up the property market again, right? They're not, the $72 billion in fast-tracked infrastructure they announced, read the fine print, it was nowhere near that. And maximum 60,000 jobs. Well, that's tiny. We've got to think much bigger than that, right? And Australia has a lot of potential. Let's take the ideological brakes off it and get behind it, and that's what you can do with a development bank.
Yeah, no, that's good. Now, there was one other topic before I get on China, so we'll come to China in a moment, but people have been asking about alternative economic strategies and MMT and those sorts of things. I am currently reading The Deficit Myth, which is Stephanie Kelton's new book. Shout out to one of the followers who actually sent it to me and said, you must read this, so I am reading it. It is a very good read. Now, MMT is very much in vogue at the moment. In fact, even Alan Kohler the other day wrote an article to say that, it's worth thinking about for these reasons, right? Because if you are a country with a currency and you can print your own money and create your own money, then essentially you've got the opportunity to do stuff with it. Have you thought about that, Robbie, and have you got an opinion on MMT?
Yeah, I have, and it's not a very favourable one. But when I first heard about MMT, the first thing I reacted to was the word modern. I'm thinking, well, this ain't that new, really. This is my copy of the 1937 Banking Royal Commission report in Australia, which was dealing with not unrelated issues because of the depression then. Now, this is quite a good reference. We use that quite a bit. They devote a whole chapter in there at the time to what was called social credit, not the Chinese social credit. It was otherwise known as Douglas credit, which was a British idea. And frankly, not that dissimilar. And then there was earlier stuff in the 20s. Look, yes, technically the government can't run out of money if it produces its own currency. That's true, and I do accept a government is not the same as a government budget is not the same as a household budget. That's also true, but only because the government has the capacity to marshal the economy's resources. Where I differ is I do not see anything being proposed as an improvement on the national bank concept, which at least you can point to the history of Australia, the history of when it was applied in the United States, and it has worked. It's certainly not an improvement on that concept, and so we are very much propose policies that have already worked. We're not trying to reinvent the wheel here or propose something new. Plus, my understanding of it, and some advocates might contradict me, but others, I think they'd end up contradicting each other. My understanding of it is it's more just this idea of, the government can spend whatever money it likes. Well, there's a difference between spending and investment, right? And we've got lots of spending in the economy. We need actual investment. You've got to direct it where it goes. You've got to have if you just leave the economy up to the consumption ideas, the aggregate consumption of all the public, well, too much money will end up at the racetrack and the casino and the whorehouse, and that's their business. But that's what some people do with their money, and it counts as GDP as well. We actually need investment, and the national bank model for investment, which doesn't have to dabble into that area of just having some kind of a mechanism where you can put as much money in. It's like you've got this meter on the side here, the inflation meter. Just keep putting money in until the inflation meter goes up, and then you start taxing it out, right? I'm not persuaded by that at all, right? I'm not a Keynesian. Keynes actually advocated, giving people money to dig holes and fill them in again. That's not real a wise thing to do with money. If you invest properly in your economy, invest in the things you don't make up stuff you don't need, invest in the things you need, but with an optimistic view to the future and a growing economy. So visionary projects that are actually going to be beneficial, right? There is enough money in the system to, take care of the needs of the economy. That's my general view of it.
Yeah, thanks. Well, I will be doing some further shows on MMT as I work my way through the book, and I've got a few other people teed up to talk about it because I think it's a very live debate at the moment. But
it's huge. It's huge. I worry a little bit that they're saving capitalism from itself in a sense. Not that I'm an anti-capitalist, but that it's just that it's interesting when all the bankers and treasury people start jumping on this idea. Right, I'm thinking, oh yeah, where's this going?
Well, and the point is, I always say it depends on where you put the money, right? So what do you do with the money, right? If you basically creating money to support the banking system and prop up the banks and stop the derivatives markets from imploding and those sorts of things, which up until very recently the Fed was doing, that's one thing. If you're actually doing it for productive investment purposes that actually creates more value for the future, that's a different story. And the question is, where does that money go, right? And it's interesting. There was an interesting article that I saw today. In fact, it was in Bloomberg, and it was the Bank of England, the new guy at the Bank of England, who actually said, we can't go on printing forever. We've actually got to stop at some point. Really?
That's a 21st century statement if I've ever heard one.
And interestingly, the Fed has actually reduced their balance sheet for the first time last week, right? For I think it was the fourth drop this year, right? Very small drop. So interesting times. Okay.
Well, just on that quickly, I forgot to mention the United States Congress actually now has three different bills or proposals for a form of national infrastructure bank there. So this has become an overwhelming problem in the United States, and finally people are getting their act together a bit. And if Trump This is something Trump actually campaigned on. If Trump reached across the aisle and worked with the Democrats who want this, they could go down that path of actually they'd have a boom if they had just upgraded America's existing infrastructure because it's so bad, right? And then that could make a big difference, and people would see the value of that for doing it here as well.
Yeah, no, good point. And the interesting question now is, in the last 15 minutes or so, right? We'll touch China. Now, I can tell you there was a whole series of questions and comments, but let me try to boil it back to...
Did I provoke?
Well, you may have provoked them, or I suspect people were sort of throwing the stone into the pond to see what would happen. But yeah. The Uyghurs and Hong Kong were by far the two most critical issues that people were concerned about. And basically, I'd be very interested to get your read on what I personally perceive to be pretty disgraceful behaviour with regard to Hong Kong and pretty disgraceful behaviour with regard to the Uyghurs. But how do you see it? I mean, do you see it the same way that I see it, or do you see something different though, Robbie?
Well, the main thing I'd say is beware of disinformation. So we didn't come at this. I'm speaking on behalf of the party now, but I'm certainly invested in it. We didn't come at this from the standpoint of we love China. We came at this from the standpoint of a lot of what people have heard me say about China in recent times is a continuation of, if they'd followed the history of our party, it's what I said about Iraq and Saddam Hussein. It's what I said about Libya and Muammar Gaddafi. It's what I said about Syria and Bashar al-Assad. It's what I've said about Russia and Vladimir Putin. And while China is an authoritarian communist country, right, and it's by definition that's what it is, and it's got communist in the name, or the party name. There's things it does that don't overly surprise me as an authoritarian country, but when there's claims about what China's doing, that's really over the top, that for you to believe that, you have to entertain the idea that there is a current of pure evil in that country, right, controlling that country. And for the public to tolerate, when people say to me, oh, it's the CCP, it's not the Chinese people. Well, there's 90 million members of the CCP. There's 1.41 billion or 31 billion members of the country. They tolerate that CCP government. So if that government's worse than Hitler, then who are they? What do you have to say about them to tolerate it? And some of these claims are so outlandish, right? Then we go and look at them and say, well, where's the truth to these claims? And what we find, because it's really hard from here in Australia to confirm the truth of anything, and so that cuts both ways. That's true. That's true for me trying to find the truth. That's true for you and all my friends who have a crack at me. Call out the cookie boy, who keep sending me Daily Mail articles of the truth. And I can tell you, if you want me to be convinced of something, don't send me a Daily Mail article about the truth. That's the worst place to start. The truth ain't going to come from there either. So then you got to play a bit of detective. And what I know we're dealing with in the last 5 years. And you and your viewers may not believe me, but I would ask people to just give some thought to what you were thinking about 5 or 10 years ago. And was China at the top of your bad list, or perhaps might it have been Muslims? Because I spent 15 years defending Australia's Muslims against all sorts of claims made about Muslims and racing around Facebook, and they do this and they do that and they do the other. And I knew most of those weren't true either, but they served a purpose. And there's a machinery that's in the United States and the United Kingdom that so we'll talk about the Uyghurs in a minute, I'll get onto that. But while we are now concerned about perhaps 1 million what they claim is 1 million Muslims locked up in Xinjiang in China, the source of those claims are the people who've killed 2 million Muslims in the Middle East. The exact people. And one of those has just been written a book about Donald Trump. John Bolton and his sidekick Frank Gaffney were part of the George W. Bush administration, and we were fighting the weapons of mass destruction lie. We were fighting the Iraq invasion plot at the time. We were identifying this gang, because he was George W. Bush, the biggest idiot to ever be president. He was controlled by a clique led by Dick Cheney, and these are the neoconservatives, right? And the neoconservative ethos is we rule the world. There will not be any rival. A unipolar or a sole US superpower will always be the power that rules the world, and we will not tolerate anything else. And any country that dares to rival us, either militarily or economically, we will preemptively attack and destroy. That's the neoconservative ethos. Well, I don't buy into that. I mean, if the world's run that way, this kind of global empire, then I think we're all toast. It's bound to end badly, and it doesn't have to be that way. But this gang took it over, and unfortunately, they defined a process ever since, and they set off this agenda of regime change. But as part of that, John Bolton and Frank Gaffney, his mate, poured out. Frank Gaffney's this thing called the Center for Policy Studies or something. At the time, they poured out this stream of anti-Muslim propaganda. And there were so many claims going around, and people are familiar with them all, and some of it, there's some truth to it, but the truth applied to really extreme Muslims like ISIS, right? But not to your neighbor, the Muslim, right? To this clique of extremist Muslims in Iraq and Syria. And what's the dirty secret about those Muslims? The really extremist ones? Our countries found them useful for their purposes in the Middle East. That's the truth about it. Just like we backed Osama bin Laden in Afghanistan, we've backed them all along. So anyway, but when it was useful for us to think that it didn't matter that we were killing Muslims in the Middle East because they're all terrorists anyway, Frank Gaffney and John Bolton were pouring that out. And then suddenly, in the last few years, they flicked a switch. Obama's policy was, we stuffed up the Middle East, we're now pivoting to Asia. Don't just take my word for it. There's lots of there's a big backlash in Australia now against this stuff. It's gone way too far, right? And more people are starting to be the voice of reason here about, hey, what are we actually doing by, accusing China of all this stuff? Once Obama said, well, China, while we've been fighting these wars, China has got itself richer and more powerful, not militarily that much more powerful, to be honest. Right? I mean, no one comes close to America's military spending, but certainly they got more powerful economically. Suddenly, everything China does is a threat. Literally everything gets painted as a threat. And last year, the same Frank Gaffney, John Bolton's mate, started this thing called the Committee for the Present Danger China. And it involves Steve Bannon, it involves Kyle Bass, it involves Robert Spalding, all names that the China bashers on the feed will remember, right? They're all there with John Bolton's best buddy, Frank Gaffney. Now, go and read what John Bolton wrote in the Wall Street Journal the other day, this chapter of his book about Trump. Because this guy was Trump's national security advisor, and now he's telling us that Trump's the worst president of all time. And why? What are the things that he attacks Trump for? Because Trump actually wants to make peace with North Korea. Trump actually wants to do a deal with China. Trump's talking about this Venezuela stunt. He wants to draw a line under it, and he's even prepared to meet Maduro in Venezuela. Right? In other words, as much as Trump's a wacko in lots of respects, he genuinely wants to end America's commitment to permanent war. He just hasn't been able to, thanks to people like John. And I know why Trump employs him, right? But now Bolton's attacking Trump for actually, just doing basic stuff to say, hey, can't we get along here, right? As outrageous as Trump's rhetoric about China has been, a lot of his rhetoric, like he did with little what do you call it, little bomber boy or whatever with Kim Jong-un. It's to an effect to try and get Trump thinks he's a great negotiator and all that. So I don't read too much into his rhetoric, but when push comes to shove, he wants to resolve these tensions, right? And he employed people who don't. And Pompeo is another one of these guys who don't. They would like to keep these wars going because they've got a whole war economy that depends on being on the cusp of war all the time. And so they're the ones that I'm fighting with, and they come up with all these claims. So just to specifically the claims of the Uyghurs. Okay, so what happened was 2018 there was a UN human rights report, one chapter of which written by one member of one panel who happened to be an American, claimed there's 1 million Uyghurs locked up in China, in Xinjiang. It was the first time there was this claim of 1 million Uyghurs. I happened to be in Parliament at the time that week this news broke, and everyone's flipping out about these 1 million Uyghurs in China. It occurred to me, because I thought, well, here's this definitely smacks of an exaggeration. It occurred to me that if some of those poor Uyghurs, with all the hand-wringing that was going on in our parliament by members of the two major parties about these Uyghurs, if some of those poor Uyghurs happened to get on a boat to escape to Australia, what would we do to them when we caught them? We would lock them up in a camp, because that's our policy. No one's allowed to come here by boat. So that's the other place I come from here. I feel as an Australian citizen, I do not have to add to the rage against China. Plenty of people do that. I feel as an Australian citizen, I'm much more responsible for my country and our human rights abuses, which are damn severe. Watch Q&A last night. So this was the claim. There was all this hand-wringing. Since then, read the Grey Zone website, which is there's a guy in America named Max Blumenthal. He's the son of Richard Blumenthal, the Blumenthal who was Hillary Clinton's closest advisor. His son is a renegade. He's a black sheep. He's got this Grey Zone website. He and his crew have done a lot of investigation on the details of this. The number one source of the claim that there's 1 million or more Uyghurs in locked up in China is a total Fruit Loop named Adrian Zenz, who is employed by one of these Cold War propaganda outfits in the United States, and it's based on an estimate of 12, based on 8 interviews. Other people have done the figures saying that, if you just take the percentage he's claiming of the biggest city in Xinjiang, at most it can only be 200,000 people. Now that still sounds bad, but I will say this, before you just look at the people that are in these, this is a de-radicalization program, and a lot of Muslim countries have gone and inspected it and have said what China's doing is the right thing. Now, what happens is when that gets reported straight away, China's bought them off, right? Because nothing China can do is right. China, well, you go and tell it to the 53 mostly Muslim countries who have actually said that's the case. But you also got to take into account, and this never gets reported in the context, that from 2008 to 2018, there was a wave of terrorist attacks in Xinjiang by Uyghur Muslims, extremist Uyghur Muslims from the East Turkestan Islamic Party. And you can see the footage online, people dressed in black robes, etc., and they'd get out with their machetes and just start hacking people to death. And whenever it got reported, all the Western media was saying, oh, what did China do to deserve it? And, of course, that got up China's nose in a big way. China banned Facebook and Google specifically because of these incidents, because when the attacks first started happening, they found out they were being organised on Facebook and Google, and they asked Facebook and Google to ban those groups from their platform, and Facebook and Google refused. And so China said, well, we're going to ban you then. 1,000 Chinese people were slaughtered from 2008 to 2018 in like 120 terrorist attacks. The worst was 200 were hacked to death in one day in Urumqi, I think in 2012 or thereabouts. Or no, that might have been the early one in 2009. These were horrific terrorist attacks. These Muslim terrorists doing it are connected to the same like there's 6,000 Uyghur terrorists in Syria right now as part of the ISIS Al-Qaeda apparatus in Syria that is effectively on the same side as our governments are in trying to topple Assad. And they say that these Uyghur terrorists there that have been running whole towns, chopping people's heads off, say we're here to train to go back to China, right? This is a serious problem. China's had to deal with it. And are they dealing with it in an authoritarian way? Yes, they are. But they are certainly trying to, it's a de-radicalization program. A lot of countries have these de-radicalization programs. And, frankly, the United States, following a terrorist attack on its territory in 2001, went around the world and killed 2 million Muslims, right, in response. In wars that, weren't directly related to 9/11, but from the standpoint of the American public, they didn't care because it was those bloody Muslims being attacked. And there are Muslim, terrorists still in Guantanamo Bay that get food forced up their rectum by the good old United States, the world's great champion of human rights, who is now turning around and pointing the finger and making wild claims about millions of people locked up in Xinjiang. So that's what I know about it. If I was the government of China, would I be doing something different? Well, with my values, I would. I hope so, but I'm not going to pass too much judgment on them based on the circumstances they've got, especially in the blizzard of so much disinformation. We've documented this on our website. We've put lots of articles up there about it, right? So you might not believe me, but I'll go back to Iraq again. I remember the incredible claims about Iraq in why Saddam Hussein was an absolute butcher. The man who works on the other side of that door there, literally has got a desk right there, is an Iraqi who fled Iraq in the Gulf War. He's the finest human being I know. He has the same birthday as Saddam Hussein. He was an Iraqi Christian, and when he grew up in Saddam Hussein's Iraq in the smallest, most vulnerable minority, he was perfectly safe. He had a great life. Everything was fine until the US went in there and started causing wars, right, and whacking sanctions on Iraq and things like that. And they told us all kinds of things about this guy, Saddam the monster. And was he authoritarian? Yes. But when they didn't just not find weapons of mass destruction when they invaded, they didn't find all the other garbage they claimed about him as well, right? Absolutely monstrous things. And the CIA officer assigned to debrief Saddam before he was hanged actually wrote a paper or an article about his experience debriefing Saddam, and his conclusion was, I think we got this guy wrong, right? Well, it didn't matter whether they got him wrong or right. All that mattered was he was the target of a regime change plot that's targeting a bunch of countries, and there's idiots in Australia who want to include China in that plot. And so forgive me when I see the same people saying the same thing, that I'm going to be skeptical about what they're saying. If you want war with China, count me out, because that's the end of the world, right? And there are people who, it's not that they want war per se, these idiots like John Bolton, they're so full of their own sense of infallibility that they're God's chosen people or something, they think that they can push China to the limit, and then when push comes to shove, a country like China will back down. And maybe they will, but that's a hell of a calculation to make, because it can also be miscalculation. And in 2012, we played on our show the other day, Malcolm Fraser warned that the policy that we're pursuing, tagging along behind the United States towards China, is heading towards a nuclear war. And Malcolm Fraser was a prime minister at a time when, in the middle of the Cold War, when they were really serious things to be concerned about, and we should be concerned about that again. And that's the perspective that we have coming from this. Look, as for Hong Kong, just quickly, sorry, Martin, all I will say is this: whatever the world wants to think, Hong Kong, the territory of Hong Kong, is part of China. That's the bottom line. Yes, they've got one country, two systems, etc. But these teenagers on the streets of Hong Kong who carry British flags and say they want democracy while they're carrying British flags, and no time in Hong Kong's history except for the last year of British rule did they have democracy in that time, and the British installed democracy as a poison pill, and they did that, and that's what British imperialists do. They leave these little landmines behind wherever they go, unfortunately. That's what they're dealing with there now. And yeah, the people of Hong Kong have the right to hit the streets and protest. But when they got really violent, and they did get violent, and don't take my word for it, but the Australian newspapers are the most pro-American, neoconservative rag in this country, when its own star reporter, Hedley Thomas, wrote in November last year, this is too much. No one wants to admit it, but these crazy rioters are destroying Hong Kong. They're terrorising the joint, right? He said that. He broke with his own party's own paper's policy to say that. All we were getting was one-sided about the rioters and the police. Oh, the Hong Kong police are the most brutal police in the world. And all I was saying all along was, don't tell me they're more brutal than anyone else. You know, you could see riots in France where the police were just as severe. And now, what do we see? Not only do we see the Black Lives Matter backlash in the United States, where we're actually seeing what true police violence can be, but we're seeing the most outspoken right-wing neoconservative politicians in the United States, who all championed Hong Kong last year, and these freedom fighters among these rioters. They were the ones, like Senator Tom Cotton, who's the Andrew Hastie of the American Congress. He's the guy who called for Trump to bring it to send in the military. And all last year, Kyle Bass and Tom Cotton and all these jackasses were saying, oh, Xi's going to send in the PLA to Hong Kong, and he never did. But when they got riots on the streets of America, oh, send in the military straight away. Do not be hypocritical. Go look at my Twitter feed, the pinned tweet. I am proudly someone who's going to point out hypocrisy. There's this Twitter term, whataboutery. It's illegitimate to point out hypocrisy. No, you're talking to the wrong guy. I always will point it out, because I know the pedigree of the people who are driving this. So that's mainly where I'm coming from. And the rest, I'm going to do my own shows soon. But there's so much disinformation about Australia, especially the questions about China's supposedly owning us all, owning everything about Australia. I mean, America and Britain have $1.5 trillion of Australia between them. China owns $60 billion of Australia, and they're the ones that are buying us out, apparently. This is the kind of thing you get in Daily Mail headlines. It's just absolute garbage. They're a big investor in land because they value land. They're the second biggest investor in land. I'll grant them that. But for the rest of it, all they are is a very, very good customer. And on America's behalf, we decided to poke them in the eye repeatedly and repeatedly and repeatedly, not just over COVID-19, when Andrew Hastie compared them to Nazi Germany and all this kind of stuff, and we're getting a backlash from it. And, I think we should just cool our jets and think more rationally about all this.
Robbie, I think that's probably enough on China, because I've been watching the comments, and I would say that you have polarized the audience between those who actually think that you're onto something and those who think that you have completely flipped. So, as you would have expected, I guess.
Yep. No, I was happy to do it. I don't want to overdo it, but I was, sorry about that. But anyway.
No. My observation is, as somebody in the chat said, I'm a philosopher, what do I think, So my perspective is, there is a frame of reference, right, which essentially says China bad, US good, right? And at the moment, many people in Australia are wired to think that way. So every time anybody says anything about China, it's bad. Everything about the US is good. The truth is that those two very large powers have probably more in common than people might want to imagine. And quite often, the particular perspectives that we are presented with are part of the truth, but not all the truth, as you were highlighting. And I think that's true also in the US. We don't get the full picture there either. So I would say to people, be questioning. Don't just take everything that you see in the newspapers as being gospel, right? There is a frame of reference behind what they're writing and what they're saying, which may or may not be true. It's worth asking the question at very least.
Yeah, and can I say, I actually always mean to do this. There never seems to be enough time, but people might not believe this. I would say the Citizens Party is the most pro-American party in Australia. As unusual as that might sound, but we are. We just have a very firm view of what America truly is, the ideal of the United States, and this. A lot of the post-war era, and especially this post-9/11 era, is not it. And, we've got lots of friends in the United States. If America goes back to its roots, the best of its roots, because all is complicated, right? But the best of its roots are all men are created equal. They have the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And there was always a fight over how you realise that ideal. And the best of them gave, like Alexander Hamilton created the first Bank of the United States to improve the American economy. Abraham Lincoln was another champion of national banking, and as part of the fight in the Civil War, and getting rid of the slavery problem. Roosevelt, etc. We're very, 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 very pro that. And a lot of China's success has come about not because it invented something new. It started emulating what made us successful, but it started emulating it. Countries like Australia and America at the time when we stopped doing those things. So it went on to use state banks to invest in infrastructure and actually be really successful. And we didn't. We did the opposite. So credit where it's due, but don't take anything I'm saying as being anti-American, but I'm very anti-neoconservative and liberal interventionist, and this idea that, well, as Andrew Hastie's friend in Oxford, Dr. Brendan Sims, who's the founder of this organisation Hastie is fronting in Australia at the moment, this British organisation called the Henry Jackson Society. Brendan Sims boasted in 2011 after they killed Gaddafi in Libya, he said, see, democracy can be dropped from 10,000 feet. We can bomb countries into being democracies. Well, look at Libya now. It's a total disaster, right? Total disaster. And these people, they never have any repercussions for that. That's what we're anti. And just because there's things about communist China you don't like, they haven't gone around killing 2 million people in the world in the last 20 years. Our side did. Yeah.
No, I think that's very pertinent. And, like I say, sometimes the context is not well understood, so that we get a particular shard of information and we keep getting fed that same perspective. And I keep saying to people, ask question. Don't just swallow it whole, right?
And don't go by the media, please.
Who's telling you? Why are they telling you? What's really behind what they're saying? And frankly, I think that one of the things I'd say generally in Australia is, and part of what DFA is trying to do, is to just help people take that extra question, So ask the question behind the question behind the question, because quite often what you'll discover is that there is a whole frame which has shaped the way that things have been presented, which is only partially right or might actually not be right at all. And unfortunately, we sometimes swallow the superficial, and our mainstream media is a part of the problem.
There is a good backlash now, though. There's lots of people that are starting to speak up in the last few weeks. Pay attention to them. A lot of them are old-timers, right? And they're not pro-China. They're just saying, hey, where's this going? And we have to be a bit cautious.
Yeah, no, I agree. Well, we've run over time massively. I have to tell you that I have so many questions in the chat that I've just given up. But we did cover the main things. So we covered derivatives, we covered the bail-in, we covered the cash ban, we covered the national bank, and we covered China.
We covered China. Yeah, you want Martin forewarned me about these main things. Look, I why don't we do this? I'll tomorrow or the next few days, I will go through some of the questions as well on the live feed and try and reply to people that ask specific questions and provide links and things like that. So I'll help you do that. And hopefully I got across the main points though. And if you got anything really burning to ask me, you can just email me, Robbie at citizensparty.org.au. Send me an email and I'll reply on that. And if I get too many, I'll outsource some of the replies. Look on our website. We've got lots of material. I mean, no one ever accuses the Citizens Party of trying to keep people in the dark. We really encourage people to subscribe to our weekly magazine. Get on our website. There's lots of material there. And let me just do a quick plug again for our show tomorrow on YouTube. We'll put up this show first in the episode in our Citizens Insight series. Watch what John Darlson has to say about the importance of dairy re-regulation. He's a free marketer saying this. It's incredibly important. We're going to lose this industry if we don't pull our finger out. And he's blowing the whistle on what the retailers are up to. And he chaired one of them, Woolworths. So it's very significant. So have a look at that as well. And, send me an email if you want more information.
Great, Robbie. Well, thank you for that. And thank you for your time tonight. It's been a a riot, literally. So I appreciate your time. Just in terms of what we are going to do next week, if I may just plug the next show, which will be a rather different show. It'll be with Damien Klassen from Nucleus Wealth. And he's going to be talking specifically about investment, stock markets, what's happening, and we'll cover things like, are the markets overvalued relative to the real economy? He's very good on housing and what's happening in housing as well. So that'll be a really interesting session. So that's next week, the 30th of June, 8 p.m. Sydney. If you have questions, feel free to send those questions through to me and via the DFA blog beforehand or live on the stream as normal. The following week, it'll be me talking about the Reserve Bank minutes, and the week after that, there's the Veronica Morgan from Elephant in the Room and from Location will be on talking specifically about property. So in the next 2 weeks, we've got economy, Reserve Bank, and property, having done China and banking regulation today. And the point I want to leave you with is that DFA is not about holding a particular point of view. It's allowing different voices to speak with different perspectives and different ideas, because that's how you have a debate and that's how you learn, right? You will not get a filtered one myopic view from me here. But I want to, Robbie, I want to thank you very much for your time today and for actually being as outspoken and bold as you have been. And I knew you would. So you didn't let me down.
No, I wouldn't want to do that. And Martin, I think I can speak for everyone. Thank you. You have the most important show on YouTube for sure in Australia. This has become an incredibly important public service. 40,000 subscribers. So kudos for that. Hope everyone listening is clapping as well. Yeah. So onward and upwards. Let's get to 50,000 and plus. So this is great.
Yeah, well, we'll keep pedaling, and thanks for your time, and thanks to all the viewers for watching as well today, and for all your comments. And Robbie is going to spend a bit of time looking over those comments, as I will too.
Supportive.
Thanks for Cookie Boy for being so supportive. Yeah, indeed. Very good.
All
right. Thank you, Robbie.
Thanks,
I'm just going to close out now, so I'll get rid of that. I've taken you offline. So thank you all very much for your time with me today and with Robbie. Thank you very much for spending way more time than normal. We'll be back next week with a different show, hopefully as interesting a show. And I just want to acknowledge Ron, Reverse French, Nico, Cronin One, and Ivan for your contributions. I think we've covered the questions that you asked, but thank you very much for that. So thank you very much. Have a good evening, and we'll see you next week. And I'm going to play the outro. See you later.